The White Star Line is likely the most famous shipping line in history. During its heyday, they were known for prioritizing the comfort of their passengers instead of speed, which was the focus for many other shipping lines. Though today, the White Star Line is probably most known for a string of maritime disasters, such as the wrecking of the SS Atlantic in 1873, which took the lives of 565 people. The sinking of the RMS Republic in 1903, where 6 people lost their lives and millions worth of gold reportedly sunk into the depths. And of course, most famous of all, the sinking of the RMS Titanic in 1912. But in addition to accidents and disasters, the White Star Line also had ships that simply provided some mystery. So in this video, we're gonna look at a ship that simply vanished. The SS Naronic. In the mid-1880s, the White Star Line decided to pivot their business model. Instead of sailing ships, they now focused on steamships. And there was a pretty specific reason for this. Cattle trade had taken off in 1874, and by the mid-1880s, it was a booming business. One that the White Star Line wanted a piece of. So they quickly got to work, and they would enter this new business venture in 1888 when the SS Cufic was launched, closely followed by its sister ship, SS Runic, the following year. At the time, it was common that the animals on board these ships would perish during the trip, mostly because of poor travel conditions, mistreatment from the crew, or both. This, of course, caused a serious financial loss to the owner of the animals. So when the White Star Line entered this particular business, they had a plan. Similar to how they would create passenger ships that prioritized the safety and well-being of the passengers, they would do the same for the animals. Their ships would be transporting goods and cattle, but they would also make sure that the animals were in good health and had much better conditions for them on board the ship. And not only that, but the White Star Line would tell their captains that part of their job was to make sure that the animals were treated well during the trip. This proved to be a smart business move. The SS Cufic and the SS Runic both performed very well, and by 1891, the company launched 2 additional carriers, the Nomadic and the Tauric. The company completed the construction of an additional 2 carriers the following year. One of these ships was the SS Naronic, constructed by Harland and Wolff and launched on the 26th of May, 1892. At the time of her launch, Naronic was the largest steam cargo ship in the world, with room for more than 1,000 animals, several thousand tons of goods, and about 15 passengers. She was also quite an expensive ship for the time. In compliance with the White Star Line's new goal, the main focus of the ship was transporting cattle that would be located on her upper and main deck, with stalls that had a fresh water supply and comfortable conditions for the animals. The ship was also fitted with special horse stalls designed to minimize the risk of injury to the horse's legs that usually were caused by the ship's vibrations. Now, like I said, cattle was the main focus, but the ship still had room for up to 15 passengers. Though usually these cabins were mostly used by people that were looking after the cattle instead of paying customers who were traveling to the United States. After successfully passing all inspections, Naronic would be handed over to the White Star Line and registered out of Liverpool under the number 99422. The ship was then quickly put in use. It wasn't long after she passed her inspections that the ship set sail for Liverpool to prepare for her upcoming maiden voyage. which would commence on the 15th of July, 1892. She arrived in New York on the 24th. The Naronic would then go on to have a pretty short but successful career. There was only one incident where the ship lost 34 animals during the trip, despite the ship providing good conditions for them. Aside from that, the ship performed its duties with much success. 5 additional voyages would be completed without much hassle, each crossing taking around 10 days to complete. Many of the crew had served on the ship since the maiden voyage, so by February of 1893, the crew were experienced and they knew their ship very well. When preparations began for the next voyage across the sea, it was pretty much business as usual. The crew knew what they were doing and they were familiar enough with the voyage to know what to expect. So by the time the Naronic left, she carried 60 crew members, 14 passengers, 2,876 tons of goods, 2 horses, as well as several cages of live pigeons and chickens. And she would depart Liverpool on the 11th of February, 1893, with no one suspecting that it would be the last time the ship was ever seen or heard from again. At 6 a.m. on February 11th, 1893, the vessel let go of its mooring under the watchful eye of harbor pilot Captain William Davies. Once the ship was clear of the harbor, Davies was supposed to depart the ship, but the waters around Liverpool were very choppy, and that made it difficult for him to depart the ship. This meant that he remained on board the vessel until she reached Point Linus in Wales later that same day. Captain Davies would depart the ship and watch as the Naronic continued on its journey, slowly disappearing into the light fog that had enveloped the Irish Sea, not realizing that him watching the ship would be the last time anyone ever saw the ship. Naronic was planned to arrive in New York on the 22nd, roughly 10 to 11 days later, but she didn't. And despite what you might think, this didn't cause much concern at first. This was because many ships that travel across the Atlantic would often be delayed due to equipment breaking down on the journey or the weather being severe. And it just so happens that in February 1893, numerous ships had been slowed down due to strong storms over the Atlantic, which meant that many ships turned up several days later than planned, all of which reported strong gales and ice fields that made their journey very difficult. So the Naronic being late did not set off any alarm bells. With reports of rough seas, strong winds, ice fields, and heavy snow even, many figured that the Naronic had just suffered the same fate as other ships. She had been delayed and would show up later. In fact, they started speculating that maybe she had diverted her course to a safer one, which took longer. This hope was only strengthened when Naronic's sister ship, the Bovic, arrived in New York on the 2nd of March, also slightly delayed. Of course, there were those who had concerns about the ship's whereabouts. Predominantly the families of the crew and the passengers, the receivers of the goods and the cattle. So the White Star Line tried to calm these concerns by pointing out that the ship was of high quality. It had watertight compartments and a very skilled crew who knew the ship well. And those reassurances did work for a time. It took several weeks before any real concern would arise. And by March 13th, with no word or sighting of the ship, the White Star Line were forced to publicly declare that there was cause for concern regarding the ship. Like I said, the White Star Line publicly downplayed any concerns, until March 13th, when they felt like they had to publicly declare that yes, something might be wrong. But that doesn't mean that they had not been internally wondering about the ship. In fact, steps had been taken to find the ship before they were forced to make a public statement. One of its sister ships, the Tauric, had placed additional lookouts during their voyage to keep an eye out for the ship. But they would arrive in New York on the 14th of March and report that they hadn't seen anything. No trace of the ship or the crew. Another ship, the Teutonic, had diverted its route south in the hope of finding Naronic somewhere along its path. But they would also arrive and report that they had seen nothing. No one knew what happened or where it happened. And one thing that complicated this was the lack of a distress call. Nothing had been heard from the ship to even indicate that the ship was in need of aid, or even where the ship was if it was in need of aid. This wasn't an oversight or someone on the ship screwing up. This was actually pretty common. Many ships during this era did not have a way to send a distress call. In case you're curious, the first usage of Morse code to ask for help was in 1909, and the system that ships like the Titanic would use to send their distress calls would not be produced until years later. So if something went wrong during their voyage, the Naronic's crew were completely on their own, with their only hope of survival being sheer luck in the form of a nearby ship passing by and spotting them. The White Star Line would make another public statement on March 15th, which said that while they held out hope that the ship and its crew would be found, they believed that it was unlikely, given the number of ships that crossed the Atlantic daily. In their view, one of these ships would have spotted the Naronic if it had been floating in the ocean. In other words, the conclusion that the White Star Line came to was that the ship must have sunk somewhere during its voyage. This belief would be strengthened slightly 4 days later, March 19th, when a British steamer called the SS Coventry reported seeing two of Naronic's lifeboats east of Halifax, Nova Scotia. One was capsized and the other was swamped, and with this, the belief was something happened to the ship and the crew had to abandon it. But what happened and where they were was still a mystery. The disappearance of the Naronic caused a net loss for the White Star Line. But more importantly, it may also have caused the loss of 74 lives, not including the animals on board. The disappearance and lack of answers was a difficult pill to swallow for the families of the crew and the passengers. So much so that the wives of two of the crew members ended up being sent to an asylum due to trauma, the uncertainty of not knowing simply becoming too much for them. All hope of locating the ship had vanished by June 1893, when an investigation was launched. The Naronic's disappearance had become a very newsworthy story, with many rumors circulating in the press, and the inquiry was set up to combat these rumors. One rumor that they were especially interested in combating came from a man living in Pittsburgh who claimed to be the brother of the ship's mechanic, and he claimed that he had received a letter from his brother. This letter supposedly said that the boilers were in very poor condition, so much so that he worried that they would threaten the safety of the ship. This was a rumor that gained a lot of traction, and the commission wanted to refute it. According to the commission, the machines and the boilers had been inspected by the Board of Trade, who described them as being the best in their category and very well maintained. This rumor about a supposed letter wasn't the only rumor. One rumor suggested that the ship had capsized after being caught in a storm. The commission would investigate this rumor as well, and they used Naronic's sister ship, the Bovik, to conduct experiments and see if there was any truth to that rumor. Those experiments reportedly showed that even if completely loaded, the Bovik remained very stable, which they took to mean that the Naronic would most likely have been very stable in those conditions as well. A conclusion that a previous captain of the Naronic also confirmed by stating that the ship was very stable. Still, the rumors persisted. The ship had sunk during a storm, or a more creative rumor said that the ship had been transporting chemicals that exploded during the journey, causing the ship to sink. Another rumor that also gained much traction, especially in the years since, is that the ship collided with an iceberg. It's definitely a plausible scenario given that several ships had reported seeing ice fields or moving through ice fields in the North Atlantic in February 1893. But the Commission did not take this into account. They said that the ship's course were not near any known ice fields, so it was unlikely that icebergs or ice had anything to do with the ship's sinking. But this was something that the press would argue against. There were several articles printed stating that several ships had reported seeing ice in the region, which meant that a ship hitting an iceberg was not a possibility one should dismiss. An argument that only grew stronger 19 years later when the Titanic would hit an iceberg in roughly the same location. The mystery of the Naronic would take a very strange turn. 4 bottles with messages inside them were found that same year. 2 of them were found in the US, in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, New York, and Ocean View, Virginia, on the 3rd of March and the 30th of March, respectively. A 3rd bottle would be found in June 1893 in the Irish Channel, and the final bottle was found on September 18th in the River Mersey near the ship's point of departure, which was Liverpool. The 2nd bottle was the most detailed. 3:10 a.m., February 19th, SS Naronic at sea. To whom picks this up? Report when you find this to our agents, if not heard of before, that our ship is sinking fast beneath the waves. It is such a storm that we can never live in small boats. 1 boat has already gone with her human cargo below. God, let all of us live through this. We were struck by an iceberg in a blinding snowstorm and floated 2 hours. Now it's 3:20 a.m. by my watch, and the great ship is dead level with the sea. Report to the agents at Broadway, New York. M. Kersey and Company. Goodbye all. This message was signed by a John Olson, cattleman. But there is a problem with that, and that is no one with that name was listed on the ship's manifest. And this is a recurring problem for all of the bottles. Each of them was signed with a name that was not listed on the ship's manifest. The first was signed L. Winsell, the 3rd bottle was signed Young, and the 4th one was signed with just T. There are some close resemblance to certain members of the crew, but not close enough. And this discrepancy means that there is a great deal of skepticism regarding the authenticity of the bottles. The Court of Inquiry would look at the bottles during their investigation, but they would dismiss them as fake. As it stands today, the assessment that the inquiry made after their investigation remains accurate. Unless new elements are provided, the probable cause of the loss of the vessel remains a matter of speculation and adds to the mysteries of the sea. As we all know, the ocean keeps its secrets, and in the case of the Naronic, the mystery is twofold. What happened to the ship, and what happened to the crew? The lifeboats that were found seem to indicate that the crew had to abandon the ship. But what happened after that? Did they survive? If so, where did they all go? And why has no one heard from them? If we entertain the thought that the messages in the bottles were actually real, then that means that the Naronic sank somewhere in the Atlantic after striking an iceberg sometime before or after 3 a.m. on the 19th of February 1893, with the crew then abandoning the ship. With reports of icebergs, and lifeboats being found, that does seem to be the most likely story. The ship hit an iceberg and the crew abandoned ship. With no way of signaling for help, it's not an unlikely scenario. Quite the opposite, in fact. But the question is, how many people were able to get off the ship, and how many perished when it sank? Another question that has popped up in later years regarding the ship is the question of why no attempts have been made to search for the ship, especially given that the ship was uninsured. Well, the answer to that question is actually very simple. The ocean is massive. No one back then had any idea where to look, and we still don't. We have no idea where the ship sank, assuming that it did. If the ship was abandoned, it may also have drifted for some time before it sank. The reigning theory right now is that the ship might have sunk roughly in the same region that the Titanic did. But remember, it took 73 years to locate the Titanic, even if people had a rough idea of where she sank. As I said before, maritime mysteries is one of my favorite topics, and the SS Naronic is very much a mystery that will remain a mystery unless we somehow stumble upon her in the depths of the ocean. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you all. Let me know in the comments what you thought of the video, and I'll see you in the next one.